She mistook my patience for weakness, my loyalty for dependence, and my silence for proof that I would never leave no matter what she did. At first, that sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after years of therapy or after they have told the story so many times that the edges have gone dull. That was not how it felt while I was living it, while I was inside it. Everything still looked ordinary enough that I kept trying to save the relationship from my own suspicions. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation smaller than betrayal, kinder than betrayal, easier to survive than betrayal. The truth did not care what I was ready for. I was not an aggressive man, and over time she started treating that as if it meant I had no limits. I believed in calm discussion, second chances, and carrying responsibility without making everything a performance. Those qualities served me well in many parts of life. In my marriage, unfortunately, they became things she learned how to exploit. Not because patience is wrong, but because patience in the presence of contempt eventually becomes permission. Hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through this kind of betrayal is how ordinary love makes you vulnerable in practical ways. You build habits around a person. You assume cooperation. You stop scanning every interaction for danger because commitment is supposed to reduce that burden, not increase it. That is why the early warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive inside normal life, mixed in with shared meals, errands, bills, inside jokes, and routines that still look solid from a distance. By the time suspicion feels serious, your heart is already heavily invested in preserving a life that may no longer exist in the form you believed. What I did not understand then was how much trust can disguise danger when you are invested in continuity. The disrespect did not arrive all at once. It accumulated through tone, dismissal, emotional withdrawal, and small cruelties that were easy to minimize in isolation. She mocked my concerns, disappeared into secretive routines, and acted offended any time I asked for honesty. If I reacted strongly, I was unstable. If I stayed calm, I was weak. That is how manipulation works when it gets comfortable. It makes every response from you sound like proof that it should continue. I kept minimizing it because I wanted the relationship to remain something I could repair with patience rather than something I would have to survive by leaving. What made it worse was not just the event itself. It was the way each new detail forced older memories to change shape. Moments that once felt harmless became loaded. Conversations that once felt routine became suspicious in hindsight. That is one of the ugliest parts of infidelity and deception. It does not only injure the present, it reaches backward and contaminates the meaning of things you once held with trust. What nobody prepares you for is how much energy betrayal steals before the relationship even officially ends. You start rereading old moments, checking your own tone, wondering whether you missed something obvious or whether you were simply loyal in a world that rewards people who hide well. That internal spiral is exhausting because it turns your own memory into a witness you no longer fully trust. I lived inside that spiral longer than I should have, mostly because admitting the full truth would have required me to accept how much of my life was about to change. What finally broke the illusion was a combination of messages and money. She had been telling another man that I was harmless, predictable, and too attached to ever walk away. At the same time, she was quietly moving pieces of her life around as if my role in it was already ceremonial rather than real. Reading that language about myself was clarifying in a way pain often is. She was not just cheating. She had built a psychological profile of me that made betrayal feel safe to her. Once suspicion became evidence, I entered a phase I still do not remember fondly. It was part investigation, part emotional free fall. I was checking devices, dates, receipts, and timelines while also trying to function like a normal adult. Every confirmation hurt, yet every confirmation also made me calmer in one specific way. I was no longer crazy. I was no longer misreading tension. The story was real, and because it was real, I could finally stop wasting energy trying to explain away what my instincts had been flagging for far too long. There is always a physical moment when the body understands before the mind does. My stomach dropped, my breathing changed, and the room seemed to narrow around whatever proof I was holding. Once I understood that, every old argument made more sense. Every moment she pushed a boundary and looked relieved when I did not explode. Every time she framed my self-control as passivity, every time she counted on my need to keep the peace, I realized that what she called weakness was actually the disciplined part of me that had been trying to preserve something worth saving. The tragedy was that I had been preserving it with someone who respected me less each time I absorbed the damage quietly. From that point on, I was no longer trying to decide whether something was wrong. I was trying to measure how long I had been living beside it without fully naming it. The scale of the truth matters because it changes the emotional category of what happened. There is a different kind of anger that arrives when you recognize you have not merely been betrayed, but studied. She had taken my best qualities and translated them into reasons she believed she could keep pushing. That realization changed my posture overnight. I stopped arguing for a better version of the relationship and started assessing whether any version of it still deserved my effort. Once you ask that question honestly, a lot of marriages end very quickly in your mind before they end on paper. Once I understood that, I stopped asking whether the damage could be explained softly. I started asking whether I could respect myself if I kept staying inside a story that required me to deny what was already obvious. Even before I made any final decision, something in me had already started separating clarity from comfort. Comfort would have meant delaying the inevitable softening language and pretending confusion was still possible. Clarity meant naming what was in front of me without dressing it up. That shift hurt, but it also gave me back a level of internal steadiness I had been losing for a long time. Eventually, there is always a confrontation, whether you want one or not. When I confronted her, I did not perform rage for her benefit. I stated what I knew, what I would no longer tolerate, and what would happen next. The shock on her face told me everything. She was not shocked by the betrayal. She was shocked that I had become willing to leave. That is the moment I understood she had been relying not only on secrecy, but on my reputation with her as someone who would always negotiate rather than depart. She had mistaken kindness for captivity. In that conversation, I learned something I have seen repeated in almost every betrayal story since. When someone has been lying for long enough, exposure does not automatically produce honesty. Often it only produces a faster, more desperate form of strategy. I also learned that closure is rarely given cleanly by the person who caused the damage. More often, closure is assembled privately from facts, behavior, silence, and the eventual realization that you no longer need a better apology in order to make a better decision. That realization was painful because it forced me to stop waiting for the other person to become morally elegant after months of choosing something much uglier. After the confrontation, the aftermath begins, and the aftermath is rarely cinematic. It is practical, repetitive, humiliating, and emotionally expensive. Once I moved out and stopped engaging the way I always had, her confidence changed shape. The calls became more urgent. The explanations became softer. The narrative of me being weak stopped working once my absence started producing real consequences for her. But by then, I no longer needed her new respect. Respect that appears only after you enforce a boundary is useful information, not reconciliation. That stage taught me more about character than the actual discovery did, because it showed me who I was becoming under pressure and who the other person remained when the lies were no longer working. There is also a social cost to betrayal that people underestimate. You start thinking about who knew what, who suspected what, and who watched the relationship deteriorate without saying a word. Even when no one intended to humiliate you, the mere possibility that other people noticed pieces of the truth before you did can feel like a second wound. It is not pure ego. It is the pain of realizing your private devastation may have had an audience long before you had language for it yourself. And then comes the part no one glamorizes: the paperwork, the practical decisions, the humiliating phone calls, the explanations you owe people who were never in the room when your life actually broke. Meals still have to be made. Bills still have to be paid. Work still expects your attention. Meanwhile, your mind is replaying scenes it cannot fix. That contrast between ordinary responsibility and extraordinary pain is one of the loneliest parts of the whole process. In the end, my decision was less dramatic than people imagine, and more important than any single argument. Walking away was not about proving I was strong. It was about refusing to keep proving I was safe to disrespect. That difference matters to me. I did not leave to win an argument. I left because staying had become incompatible with self-respect. The day I finally understood that, the marriage became much easier to release, even while the grief stayed heavy. That decision did not erase grief. It simply gave grief a direction. Instead of circling endlessly around the betrayal, I began moving away from it, step by difficult step. Recovery did not begin with peace. It began with routine. I had to rebuild trust in small, unglamorous ways, by keeping promises to myself, by protecting my sleep, by speaking honestly to the people who had earned access to my life, and by refusing to keep confusing suffering with loyalty. That process was slower than I wanted and less dramatic than movies teach us to expect. But it was real, and reality mattered more to me now than performance ever could. A major part of recovery had nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with identity. I had to figure out who I was when I was no longer organizing my choices around managing their moods, their lies, or the fallout from their decisions. That sounds abstract until you live it. Then it becomes very practical. Different mornings, different habits, different spending, different boundaries, different standards for what gets access to your time. The rebuild was not only emotional, it was structural, and that structural change is what made the healing last instead of feeling temporary. My wife thought I was weak until I walked away. The truth is that leaving required more strength than staying ever did. Staying would have let me keep avoiding the reality that the relationship had become degrading. Leaving forced me to choose clarity over comfort. I am proud of that choice in a way no amount of patience ever made me feel proud before. I do not tell this story because I enjoy revisiting it. I tell it because there are people still living inside the version of confusion I once called normal. If you are one of them, I hope you understand this. Clarity may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will keep protecting a lie because you are afraid of what truth will cost, or whether you will accept the cost and finally keep your own dignity intact. That choice is brutal. It is also where a real life starts again, and that is the part I wish more people understood. Betrayal is dramatic in the discovery, but its real meaning is revealed in what you do next. Do you go back to sleep emotionally because the truth is expensive, or do you let that truth reorganize your life around something cleaner? That question changed everything for me. If you have lived through something similar, then you already know the answer is never simple. But it is still worth saying out loud, because silence